Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. All right, so I've been getting a lot of feedback from the field, people asking me to update my CDFM Module 3 videos. Because if you review the Module 3 videos, you'll see I'm really covering the 2011 study guide. And the reason I hadn't updated with the 2018 study guide, because I've reviewed the material and it doesn't seem like there's a lot of changes. However, the public has asked for me to update the videos for CDFM Module 3 from the 2018 study guide, just so we can feel comfortable that we're getting the most accurate information. So let us begin CDFM Module 3 out of the 2018 study guide. You must have your own version, your copy, and beginning on page 3.1.7. So the basic axiom is the same. That means that financial managers must have the budget authority in writing to tell us what we can and cannot do with the appropriations, the funding. So when you go to page 3.1.8, it talks about constitutional authority. At this point, once you're in Module 3, you should already know when they say Article 1 of the Constitution, who they're addressing, which branch of government. So when we begin the process, I told you to learn executive, let me repeat. I told you to learn legislative or Congress, executive, the president, and your judicial branch. The reason you want to learn them in that order because they directly align with Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 of the Constitution. So it makes it easier for you to remember. So automatically on page 3.1.8, when you see Article 1 of the Constitution or Article 1, Section 7, 8, and 9, you know this is directly talking about the duties and responsibilities of Congress. So Article 1, Section 7 says it empowers Congress to raise revenue. The second one, Article 1, Section 8, says Congress can collect taxes. And then the one that's most important to us and the reason that the government shuts down if we do not have an appropriation is Article 1, Section 9. So definitely you need to know that one. Because we're always talking about continuing resolution, the government's going to shut down. Why? Because the law says in Article 1, Section 9, that no funding will be removed from the Treasury unless we have an appropriation law in place. Next, it talks about the GAO Red Book, GAO Principles of Appropriation. Within the CDFM study guides, you're going to learn the GAO Red Book, the GAO Yellow Book, and the GAO Green Book. If you think about it, it's like a stoplight. Red, yellow, green. The red book deals with appropriation, the yellow book deals with auditing, and the green book deals with internal control. So if you learn them like a stoplight, wherever you process forward, you will remember that. And as you are studying, as you move along, if you see a topic that you know you've already discussed, you need to pause and remind yourself what you know about that topic. So GAO, who is GAO? What does it stand for? That's just an acronym. Make sure you know what acronyms mean because you may see it on an exam where they give you various explanation of that acronym, and if you don't know what right looks like, it'll be difficult to pick it out. So the Government Accountability Office is the GAO, and they give us the standards for the use of the appropriation. Who is the GAO? Why do they give us standards? The Government Accountability Office, accountability, is an external auditing agency that works directly for Congress. So when I started, we said that Congress gives us the do's and don'ts, tells us what we can do with the funding and what we cannot do. Well, guess what? If no one's checking to make sure we're following those rules, then most of us do what we want to do with the funds. So that's the job of the GAO, to be that fact check checker to ensure that we are following the do's and don'ts of what Congress says we are to do or not to do with these fundings. So that's who GAO. So you always going to remember that because you're going to see it in Module 1, 2, and 3 of your exam. You have the various laws. I don't talk about that. The chart on page 10, 3.1.10 at the bottom, you see OMB Circular A11. That's another acronym. Who is OMB? Office of Management and Budget. The next question you ask yourself is, who do they work for? Why are they important in this hierarchy? We say GAO works for Congress to tell Congress what we are doing with the funding. Office of Management and Budget is the resource management office for the executive branch, the second branch of government. So the OMB circular, when we get guidance from OMB, it comes in a circular. Circular A11 deals with budget. It deals with the budget formulation, budget execution, how we budget planning, all of it. You can go to OMB Circular A11 to get that information. So that's why it's important. Why is OMB important? Because the Department of Defense, Department of State, Department of Education, everyone gets their funding document from the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB. So we got our sources of authority. When it comes to use of appropriations, government funding, every appropriation has a specific purpose, time, and amount. And based on which one we're dealing with, they are also covered in, you'll hear the term ADA violation. Oh, so-and-so committed an ADA violation. What does that mean? Anti-Deficiency Act. So there are different anti-deficiency acts based on whether you violated purpose, meaning that I use appropriation, let's say I use military construction appropriation to pay soldiers, to pay civilians. That's a no-no, unless it's specifically covered under that appropriation. So purpose is covered under 31 U.S. Code 1301. Time is covered under 31 U.S. Code 1502. And amount has 3 sections, 1341, 1342, and 1517. And no, I'm not looking at the book for them. Yes, you need to know each one of those. And what do they say we can or cannot do? So purpose is the first one, covered on page 3.1.13. Meaning that every appropriation has a specific purpose for which it is created, for which it was given to us. And we can only stay within those guidelines to spend that funding. So 31 U.S. Code 1301 discuss purpose. Now, when you're talking about purpose, you're trying to figure out, okay, I need to purchase XYZ. Which appropriation do I use? So I have to look at the purpose of each appropriation that I have. And on the next page, it talks about general expenses, specific expenses, and so forth. But I'm going to go over to page 16, 3.1.16, where it talks about the necessary expense doctrine. Or sometimes you'll hear it called the necessary expense rule. When you're looking at the purpose, you got to ask yourself, whatever I need to do, does this funding bear a logical relationship? Are they similar to what we're trying to do? The second question you ask yourself, is it already prohibited by law? Sometimes Congress will say, do not purchase XYZ with these funds. So you have to look through the laws to see, is it already prohibited by law? Or is it funded elsewhere? Sometimes through the NSN, through the supply channel, you can purchase things through the supply channels instead of getting a brand new contract. So as financial managers, we can't rely on the lawyers, regardless, even if you get a legal review. We are still liable for the documents that we sign, meaning if there's a loss, if there's fraud, we have to pay that funding back out of our pocket. So we have to understand what the law says. So purpose was covered under 31 U.S. Code 1301. And you apply the necessary expense doctrine. The next one is time on the page 17. 31 U.S. Code 1502. Time says every appropriation has a specific timeline for which you can obligate or spend the money. Whether you're dealing with MilPERS, where you pay military personnel, O&M for training and civilian personnel pay, research and development, you have procurement, military construction, and shipbuilding and Navy funds. Different types of funding categories. There's a specific timeline for each one of those. So when you deal with time on page 18, you apply the the bona fide needs rule. Meaning, I'm typically supposed to use current year funds for current year requirements. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule. If I have a big project and it has a long lead time and I need to start putting in the paperwork now to get the preliminaries and so forth. We're not talking that. Straightforward funding has a specific time. Whether the fiscal year, we operate on the fiscal year, 1 October of one year to 30 September of the following year. So all throughout this exam, keep that in mind, because there are instances where you are going to have to say, if I say you have military construction funds, you're going to have to tell the individual or say, which fiscal year is that fund available for new obligations? If you remember, military construction funds are good for 5 years, and then it expires for an additional 5 years. So that's 10 years. And they may ask you, when will these funds enter the expired state? So you remember, you operate in fiscal years, and then you have to calculate to figure those things out. Under bona fide needs rule, when it comes to obligation, you have two types of services. You have severable services and non-severable. The difference there is severable service means that if I want to end that contract now, I would have still gained a benefit from the services that I had up to that point. The greatest example is a cleaning service. That's a severable service. They clean once a week, twice a week, whatever. I've been getting the benefit of that cleaning service cleaning, but at some point, they may say, you know what, we're not paying for cleaning services anymore. Severable means I can end that contract based on the guidelines in the contract stating for convenience of the government, and it will be no issues. The only thing you need to know with severable services is if you have a contract that's 12 months or less. So just remember 12 months or less. If it's, let's say, August, and I have to do a severable contract, you will obligate the entire amount of the current year funding for that 12-month contract, even though it crosses fiscal year. However, let's say that same severable contract was a 13-month contract. We are limited to only obligating up to 12 months of current year for the entire year of that contract, and for that additional year, we have to wait until we get the new appropriation to obligate that fund. So I hope I made that clear. Severable, you can only obligate the full amount of the contract up to 12 months, regardless of crossing fiscal year. Non-severable are those items that I have to complete the whole work to get a benefit. For example, I want to renovate a building. I want to pave a parking lot. Doesn't make sense if the whole parking lot has potholes and then I'm only repairing part of it. I need to complete the whole. So typically, the same rule applies. You will obligate the full amount of that contract when you enter into that contract. And a good example of a non-severable service is training. If you only study page 1 and page 2 of this study guide, well, you have not gotten the benefit of going through the entire book. So training is typically, when you go to a school, they have specific markers of things that you have to accomplish to be successful in that class, in that training. So training is an example of a non-severable contract. There are 2 permissible actions that we have when it comes to the end of the fiscal year or the beginning of our new fiscal year. There's the one that we're most familiar with, where it says subject to availability of funds. That means Congress did not appropriate new budget for the next fiscal year. So we're operating under a continuing resolution. And if that is so, then we cannot have any new contracts. So if we have a contract in place, we got to say that you could do the paperwork and just say subject to availability of funds. However, there are some instances where Congress, like 2 years ago, where Congress appropriated our money in September for that 1 October. So when it came to 1 October came, we already had a budget. So all you do is just cite that budget authority to go ahead and enter into that contract. On page 3.1.21, it talks about termination of contracts. Sometimes you may have a contractor doing a job, and as the contracting representative, it is your responsibility to evaluate the work of that contractor. So let's say contractor is not meeting the standards for which they were hired. Electrical work is not up to standard, whatever it is. And for some reason, now you have to request termination of contract. Well, what do you do with the funding that you had on that contract? Couple of things. One, working with the contracting office, the KO, we still have to pay that individual for the work that we did accept up to that point. So once we pay them, whatever balance is left on that contract, we can utilize the rest of that funding to get another contractor to complete the work. That's assuming that they don't have to tear down everything the other contractor did. But if you go outside of the scope of the original contract in any way, increase in funding, you need to change the statement of work. Now you have a new request that you have to submit, and you cannot use the funding that you had for the old contract to complete the work. So the bottom line is you cannot go outside of the scope of what was already approved. Page 3.1.22 goes into appropriation life cycle. So this kind of repeats when we started off with the timeline. Purpose, time, so we're in time, 31 U.S. Code 1502, wherever you are, continuous to repeat that information so that you remember. So the different types, you have annual appropriation or single year, multi-year, your 2-year, 3-year, 5 years, and then you have no year, which is your X funds. These are typically your working capital fund. And since I'm here, I'm going to talk about working capital fund. No year appropriation simply means in your X funds is that they don't expire. A working capital fund, the best example is your commissary. Your commissary takes their funding to buy the food to put on the shelf. Then based on what it costs them to put it on the shelf, that's how they calculate what to charge the customer. Then we go in, we buy the items from the commissary, and then it rotates, it revolves. That funding goes back to the commissary to then buy more items to put on the shelf. Continuous revolving revolution does not expire. However, of course, there are guidelines. They can't just operate. The goal of the working capital fund or the no year funds is to break even. The government cannot make a profit. A good chart for you to cover, and actually let me see, and I think I'm going to do a couple more. I'm going to end on time, and then we'll start another video for amount. On page 3.1.23, it talks about the DoD appropriations time limits. And as you remember, MILPERS and O&M are 1 year expense appropriation where you pay soldiers, you do for training. But under operation and management, the O&M, operation and maintenance, you see there's a couple things there. You can use minor construction. You can do minor constructions under 2 million. If you updated your study guide from the notes the ASMC sent out, you will see that 1 million changed to 2 million. So minor construction on projects. So yes, you can use O&M dollars to do constructions. It's got to be constructions under $2 million. You can also use O&M to procure, because we have a procurement fund that you have to get, or you can use O&M, but the cost must be less than $250,000. Then you can use your O&M funds. So O&M can be used to purchase different things, but you must know those thresholds to do that. So O&M and MILPERS are 1 year expense. RDT&E are 2 year appropriations. You have your procurement is a 3 year appropriation, and it's an investment. And then you have SCN, shipbuilding and conversion Navy, is a 5 year appropriation, and military construction is a 5 year appropriation. That means they are good for new obligation within those time limits I listed. And once those time limits are done, now they enter into the expired state. So I'm going to jump over to page 3.1.25, that slide at the bottom. Every appropriation has a current state when they're available for new obligation, the expired state, and the close. And you need to know what things can be done in each one of those phases. So in the current state, I can obligate funds, commit and obligate funds in the current state. When it enters the expired state, so most people don't understand when the fiscal year ends, it doesn't end for us because we're still operating on that expired state, and every fund stayed expired for an additional 5 years that we're still closing out our books while we are operating the new funding. So the only thing you can do in an expired state is upward and downward adjustments. In the closed state, those funds no longer fall under our privy or preview or under our control. Those funds are returned to the Treasury and placed in the miscellaneous receipts account at the Treasury. But there's a 1% rule when you study that part of it. Is going to say that you can use up to 1% of current appropriation for that same type of appropriation. You can use 1% to pay a bill that comes in for an appropriation that was closed. You may have that type of leeway in your operation where you can take your current appropriation to pay an expired bill or a closed bill, but most organizations do not. So when you read through, when you do the study guides, I only kind of highlight the important things on each page, but I would advise you to, one, read through every material on each page, make notes to the sides of the pages so that you can understand what you are reading. The second time you read the material, you simply focus on the things, the notes you wrote to the side to point out the important things on that page. And then the third time you read the same material, you should be able to just look at the topic like I'm doing and then be able to speak intelligently about the information on that page. And not everything in this study guide is going to be on the test. So let me get my disclaimer out now, because some people come back and say, hey, there were certain things on the test that's not no way in the study guide. That is correct, because if you look at the beginning and the ending of the CDFM study guides, there are a bunch of references that ASMC has placed within there. The expectation is for you to read them. Maybe you have that kind of time. Most of us don't. However, you do have enough information in the study guides themselves. If you understand the key players, the key documents, the processes involved, why things happen the way they do, the hierarchy, the chain of command. Once you grasp all of that, and it's like taking a puzzle and placing those pieces in the right places, then you can still be successful on this exam without having to go to every single references that's listed. But the way ASMC is going to get around that, when you say that something is not in the study guide, they're going to say, hey, it was in one of the references. Did you read the reference? And you're going to probably say no. And then they're going to say, okay, well, go study. All right. So thank you for joining as we study CDFM Module 3 out of the 2018 study guide. Be sure to subscribe. Be sure to check that little icon at the top where you can get the alerts as I continuously update these videos to make sure that you get the most up-to-date information. So thank you for joining the CDFM study group, and I'll see you guys again next time.